In today's fast paced world, driven by AI and rapid change, it can feel challenging to keep up. But what if the purpose of education lies in our stories? In the continuity of our past and present. In this episode, we talk to historian and futurist Phil Cummins about how we can build schools for the future while staying true to our core mission. Let's jump right in. Phil, I'm so excited that you brought up your history background because that was one of the first things that stood out to me. And I wonder how your experience as a history teacher, your perspective as a historian, influences your research and your work with schools.
That's a really interesting question, Cindy. Thank you. I think that wherever our primary discipline is located, it influences, I'm going to use a long word, the epistemology of what it is that we do as an educator. So as a history teacher, as historians, we're interested in the story of humanity. We're interested in the story of people. So very much in the work that we do with strategy, with schools, it's very much about the story of yesterday and today and tomorrow, and helping leaders draw together the strands of a thread around that. At the same time, if we're going to, as we do, help people put together future fit frameworks for education that can help their school be a school for tomorrow, which is the name of our organisation that works with schools in all around the world. If we want to help schools to become a school for tomorrow, then we need a framework which allows us to travel down a set of corridors where we can make good judgments about the relative merit of different factors within a school and their importance to us. Because that's what historians do. Historians tell stories and they make judgments about what's important along the way. And, you know, when you're teaching kids history, that's what you want to do. You want to teach them to be historians. You don't want to just do history with them. And similarly, if you want to bring that sort of discipline to the way in which a school or a school system functions, well, we want to tell stories, don't we? Human beings have been telling stories since earliest times. It's our first and most powerful way to communicate with each other, the narrative.
I adore that. It's a theme that's come up in quite a few conversations, the importance of storytelling, whether it's for branding in a school or for getting team on board for changes. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you do with leaders to help them kind of unpack the story of their school? Any strategies or routines that we might try if that's a question we're asking ourselves?
Yeah, great question. There's a lecture series that I've been doing at the Smith School at Oxford University for the past few years, working with one of their leadership programs there, which is all about what it means to be a contemporary leader. And we start with the notion of tell your story, because if you can't tell your own story, you can't hope to tell the story of a community. And it's that active sharing in at a school for tomorrow and our podcast Game Changers. We talk about the notion of taking a big step forward and up. If we're going to ask people to take a big step forward and up, then we need to be able to model that ourselves. We need to be able to demonstrate to others that we're not just prepared to ask people to do something, we're not prepared to do ourselves. So we've got to, John C. Maxwell, talks about a leader as someone who knows the way, goes the way, and shows the way. So you've got to be able to tell your own story first, and you've got to remember that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that there's a purpose to every story. And in doing that, in putting together that story of your own life, you've then got to be prepared to think about your own purpose as what you do. So you've got to be able to think about telling your own story. You've got to understand what you think is your compelling reason why, and the people and the place and the planet which you're prepared to serve, and then how you want to put that into practice. But telling your own story is really important. Helping a community tell its story is really important. When it comes to a community, you need to take data from a community. You need to talk to all of the stakeholders to make sure that every stakeholder's got voice in what it is that a school might become. And you can do that in a range of different ways, through surveys and through conversations and focus groups. There's a school in Brisbane here in Australia that I've been working with recently. But we actually spent 9 days immersed in the school culture, just asking big, broad, open questions. Essentially, tell me about your school, tell me what it's like here, and so on. Try not to lead people towards an answer, but allow them to tell their own stories, and then you, like my grandmother used to, stitch it together.
This episode of the School Leaders Project is brought to you by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. We started as a passion project and a school that thought that teaching tech should be as innovative as teaching teams. And we're now loved by more than 2,000 schools all around the world. Now, let's dive back into my conversation with Phil Cummins. Beautiful. Well, and what a beautiful experience for someone who's either been at a school for a long time or for someone who's brand new coming in as a new leader in a school. Just to say that, tell me the story of this school. Tell me what makes this place special and what's worth holding on to, and what we're taking moving forward. So I just think it's such a beautiful concept, the storytelling piece. So thanks for giving us a little bit of action there.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. I think it's important that when we tell a story, we're co-authors of a story together. And somehow we talk about the notion at a School for Tomorrow. We talk about the notion of going on a journey from me to you to us. So you've got to be able to start with your own story, but then very quickly at an interpersonal level, we've got to establish what's our common shared story. But then as a whole community, we've got to find that us, because if we can find an us, then we've got a reason individually and collectively to go beyond self-interest towards the selflessness that drives a community, that drives a society, that drives a nation, that can drive a world, hopefully.
That collective teacher efficacy, the collective organizational efficacy. Yeah, awesome. That takes me to kind of your catchphrase, if you will, of today's learning for tomorrow's world. So I wonder if you might kind of dig into this concept for us and explain why it's so critical for schools today to be thinking this way.
So if we're going to talk about today's learning for tomorrow's world, we've got to build an ecosystem for that type of learning to occur in. And that ecosystem needs to be human-centered. It needs to be technologically enriched. It needs to be people and place and planet conscious. And it needs to be intentionally purposeful. That's what our research tells us. We need to be very purposeful about a set of graduate outcomes for our learners that speak to the capabilities and the character and the competencies and the wellness that they need in the world. So we talk about good people. We talk about future builders, continuous learners and unlearners. We talk about solution architects. We talk about responsible citizens, and we talk about team creators. And why do we do that? Because tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people around the world have told us that that's what they want their children to become. And so with that in mind, we need to remember that the purpose of school is not simply cramming information into kids so that they can replicate that in examinations that will determine what the next step is for them. Social mobility is important and has always been important as a function of school. But if we really want to be today's schools for tomorrow's world and do today's learning for tomorrow's world, and we want to lead today's learning for tomorrow's world, then we need to remember that the purpose of school is about the person that we're producing and their capacity to flourish in that rapidly evolving, wildly unpredictable world of tomorrow.
Beautiful. Well, just so many of the themes that stand out to me, the one driver being just intentional practice, and linking your values, linking what you want the future to look like into, your plans for now. So I guess I'm just wondering, this can all feel really theoretical, and so I'm wondering kind of on two levels, both on the leadership level. We've talked a little bit about the storytelling and the visioning, but what are those really practical action steps I can take to make this work in my schools? And then also in the classrooms, what does it really look like when we shift our pedagogy to value character and to value that whole child development?
Okay, so great questions. Let's take the first one first. I'll talk to you about a group of schools that I'm working with right now to help leaders of those schools. It's a system of 164 schools here in Australia, and we're doing a program with them. They're doing a whole thing on research and innovation for impact. So there's a group of 17 of those schools. which have decided to pick up pilot projects which are modelling today's learning for tomorrow's world. And there's a whole team that's helping them to do that. Brilliant research team. Uh, my role is to work with the principals, particularly of those schools, but also what they would call senior leaders. You might call them superintendents of groups of schools. Um, to think about the leadership, which is about sponsorship of a project, not leading a project. So and that of itself means that if you're going to create innovation in a school, not just improvement of the status quo, but innovation, you need to create time and space and build the habits of reflection that are imbued with an environment of psychological safety, of the freedom to wonder and to wander, um, to do things by trial and error, to learn from failure, and to understand that that pressure that we put on people to perform at the highest standard all the time, that when you're doing something new and different, and you're in a space of conscious incompetence because you're brand new at it, so you don't really know what you're doing. You're just trying it all out. It's all okay, and that we're all in this together. And that's very, very different from creating the time and space, which is about driving performance. Because driving performance is about replicating that which is known and making the experience consistent everywhere. So we want to get consistency and we want to get quality. But before we can get to that, we've got to have a space where we're free to play in the sandpit and work out what it is that we need to do. If as leaders we don't create those sandpits for people to play in, and we make everything about that high performance, no mistakes, no errors, then we will end up with cultures of fear and cultures of where creativity is valued less than compliance. So that's the first thing. That's I think a really practical example that's coming out from the learning of this group of schools is that if we don't allocate time to play in the sandpit, we'll never get to the point where we'll know what we're doing and what's right for us. Let's talk about a classroom.
Let's dig a little more into leadership.
Yep, sure.
First, but
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure you've experienced this though, that I feel like we all know this in our hearts. Like we know that performance-driven goals tend to be demotivating, performance on some kind of an external test or something. But the reality is that those things do still exist in our schools. Like at the end of the day, the SAT is what determines whether or not kids get into college. It's a big part of why people are paying so much money to send kids to our schools. So like,
Yep.
how do we really navigate that tension authentically?
Well, I think it's important not to create a false dichotomy between performance and creativity, between improvement and innovation.
Yes.
There are different conditions under which they thrive, but the reality is that they're both important components of the life of a person. Like we talk at our theory of character development, we've been running the world's longest and largest research program into character development and an education for character development in schools. We began it back in 2012, and it's still going today in countries all around the world. Our theory of character development says that a human being develops character in two ways. The first is that they try to realize a sense of who they are internally, the inner drive to become myself. Second way they do it is that they try to replicate the standards and expectations of those around them. The Gates Foundation, when it did the research into effective teaching back in sort of 2007, 2008, found that great teachers not only get fantastic standardized test scores and SAT results and all of that sort of thing, they're able to teach the fundamental concepts that sit behind their subjects as well too. So a great history teacher gets great results on examinations, but they also teach their kids how to be historians and what it means to contemplate the story of humanity and the role that individuals and groups and organizations can play within that, and how we can use that story to think about connecting our past, our present, and our future.
Well, and it's a thing that comes up so often on the show that the test is the floor, and we really do ourselves a disservice our entire school community a disservice if we set the test as the ceiling. Like, it's the end all be all. That's what we're working towards. It's like, no, 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 no. The test is just one measure that's there to make sure that our school is equitable and that we're teaching what we should be teaching. We ought not be afraid of that, but there's so much beyond the test and so much beyond those the didactic subject that we all value more. So let's focus on that, and the test will take care of itself.
And look, let's be honest, if we're human beings, if there isn't a test, we're probably on the couch eating potato chips watching sport, aren't we? Like, we've got to, we need external stimuli in our lives to keep us honest and to keep us focused and to keep us on task. So this idea, sometimes I see, we'll talk to teachers about extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. And I guess that's our model of character, sort of draws on that sort of wrestling between the intrinsic and the extrinsic. There's no human being who is entirely intrinsic in nature. All of us, the human, human beings were made to live in community with each other. We were made to wrestle with the expectations of family and friends and community around us. So it's a good thing that we have expectations. It's a good thing that we've got vehicles to do that. Are tests the best way to do that? Sometimes.
Debatable.
Yeah, sometimes not. Can we find better and richer and more authentic ways to test kids and to assess where they're up to on their journey of the development of character and competency and their wellness? Absolutely. And that's part of our responsibility as teachers, as chalkies, as we would have called them back in the day. It's part of the responsibility of a chalkie is to make sure that the gap between the game of school and the game of life is as narrow as possible. So we're not just testing for the sake of testing. It's actually part of a rehearsal of how to live a life that's both worthwhile and well lived.
Beautiful. All right, I love it. So I feel pretty clear on the leadership side of things. Now might we pivot into those the practices that you see that really are the game changers in terms of character education and a holistic education in the classroom? What are kind of the movers and shakers there?
Yes. Okay. So, like, a lot of this is really common sense stuff, but it can get lost in the hustle and bustle of every day. So, the starting point for everything is relationship. If we don't build the right sorts of relationships with our students, with our learners, then everything's occurring on a transactional level. It's about taking a bunch of content, putting it into a vehicle called a student, starting the engine, and then hoping that they can then replicate that content in that testing regime. And we know that there'll be pretty much a standardized distribution of those who can replicate brilliantly and those who can't replicate at all, and a bunch of people sitting in the middle. That's not a great place, I think, for a relationship to stop. Instead, what we want to look at are relationships that are transformational in the lives of individuals and groups of students, and we call that character apprenticeship. And character apprenticeship is built on the notion that it's our job as adults to teach our students who they might become. And as adults, therefore, we model it, we coach it, and we scaffold it. The knowledge, the skills, the dispositions, and the habits required in our discipline. After all, we teach who we are, fundamentally. Mm-hmm. It's the job of students then, as we're modelling and coaching and scaffolding, not just presenting stuff that needs to be memorised. It's the job of students as we model and coach and scaffold to explore, to reflect, and to articulate what it is that they've learned along the way. And they need to gain increasing mastery of that over time. And as they do, then we gradually release our agency and we promote their agency. And in doing that, what we want is we want our students to find their voice, to find their agency, and then essentially the advocacy that speaks to that selflessness that I talked about earlier. And so in time, we begin as the experts. We step back, the student, the novice becomes the expert in their own right, and they then pass that on to other people. So I would say we can talk about all sorts of pedagogical approaches and devices and so on and blah, 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 blah. But from what we've seen and from the research that we've seen others doing around the world, the only pedagogy that really matters is relationship. You need to know how to design a learning relationship so that you can do this process of character apprenticeship. And yes, you're going to do explicit instruction in it. And yes, you're going to do inquiry-based learning in it. And yes, you're going to do some tests in it. And yes, you're going to do all of that sort of stuff is going to be built into that process. And you're going to think carefully about it. And one group of students won't be the same as the next group of students. And you've got to keep mixing it up and trying to work. And, you have to work at your craft, but you've got to get those relationships right. Because as I said, fundamentally, we teach who we are. If you think about it, most of the teachers who you remember when you went to school, you can remember very little about the specifics of what they taught you, but you remember who they were and what they taught you about being and becoming in their particular space. And that's what we want to do. Look, there's a whole lot of other stuff I can talk about as well too. If we want to talk about situational pedagogy, then I can talk to you about the blend between explicit and implicit, between planned and spontaneous, and understanding that most of us have a set of preferences in our pedagogies and that we need to be able to use all of those types of a range of different pedagogies that suits different situations. So the person who likes to be explicit and planned all the time needs to learn how to be spontaneous and implicit in what they do. So you can't just plan everything and you can't just drill. It's not just death by PowerPoint all the time. Sometimes there's the teachable moment. I mostly, when I taught, I mostly taught high school and I mostly taught senior classes. Although Australian high schools tend not to have middle school structures. So I would teach 12-year-olds and sort of 17, 18-year-olds is what I tended to teach. When you're teaching 17, 18-year-olds and it's first lesson on a Monday, you don't dive straight into the content because there's really important work that needs to be done about grounding kids in the cycle and the rhythm of the week. You need to know what happened on the weekend. Like if you don't know what's happening on the weekend with a group of 17 or 18-year-olds, then how will you know what space they're in and where they're located in relation to their learning? Right. So there needs to be a little bit of time to ease students into the rhythm and cycle of a week. However, if it's a Thursday and it's 10 o'clock in the morning and there's work to be done, bang, straight into it. Let's get going. So 3 things to think about: that relationship of apprenticeship, of character apprenticeship, the modelling and the coaching and the scaffolding so that students can explore, they can reflect and they can articulate with the gradual release of agency so that students can find their own voice, agency and advocacy as experts. The balance between the explicit and the implicit and the spontaneous and the planned in terms of situating your teaching. And then thirdly, understanding the situation and the rhythm and the cycle of the week and of the year with your students. And understanding that, so that they can be co-authors of the learning. What do we know about history? History is a contested space. What do we know about classrooms? Classrooms are negotiated spaces. If we want to work together, then we've got to work out how to do that. I don't believe in the pedagogy of control. I'm very worried about what I see going on around the world, where usually you'll see people, they'll talk about the something of something. So it might be the science of learning or the science of reading or the this or that. And really, it's just a way of saying, you must do this your way. You must do this my way. There is one way. I have the answer. Well, there's not one answer. There are many answers. And the answer that's right is the answer that's in the moment, in that relationship, in that space that's negotiated between the teacher and the students.
Beautiful. I lit up when you said the term character apprenticeship, because I've been nerding out recently about cognitive apprenticeship. And I think especially in the world of AI and especially in the world of thinking and making our thinking visible, this concept of apprenticeship, I think, is going to have a resurgence. So how did you land on that term? Like, did it come from cognitive apprenticeship? Or
you bet it did.
Yeah, where did
you bet it did?
Yeah,
so we're nerding out. We're just nerding out together. We're traveling on parallel lines, and we've both landed on this notion of a cognitive apprenticeship. which can be then applied within an educational context. There's so much of what we do. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there's anything of the research that we do and the work that we do with schools which is entirely original. We stand on the shoulders of giants.
Mm,
So, but it's our
yeah.
responsibility to take an idea and take a concept and say, how could we make this work in the school concept?
I love it. Well, and connected to that, I think that's one of the things that's been an aha for me recently is the importance of dispositions in terms of learning, having the dispositions of curiosity and empathy and wonder. And Ron Richart was just on the show and talking about this, about one of the biggest challenges that we face when we're thinking about the idea of dispositions is just being able to recognize situations in which that disposition is called for. So, do you see that as kind of the primary role of this character apprenticeship, is almost putting yourself as a role model in these situations for the learners? Or can you speak to that a little bit?
Um, well, first of all, Ron Richards, what a guy, and what a like. If you want to talk about learning dispositions, he's fantastic thinker and writer and influencer in our space in that area. So anything I would have to say about learning dispositions is really you know I'm just standing in the shadow of the giant, really. Um, but but that notion of matching the situation of the learner to the situation of the learning and the situation of the teacher, um, that sort of mix around that. If we don't get the disposition of the learner and the disposition of the teacher, and absolutely right, then we're not going to get in the right space for it. So
Mm.
let's use a really practical example around that. It's a Friday afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. We're in, I don't know, somewhere in Western New South Wales in Australia. It's probably, it's maybe November, so it's about 35 degrees centigrade outside. I don't know what that is in your strange Fahrenheit land in America, but
Hundreds.
it's
I'd
well
say
up
it's
near
like
the hundreds.
110.
Yeah, it's up near the hundreds, and it's a hot day outside. Um, Kids have been at it all day. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If you're a smart teacher at that point in time, then you need to be thinking about what is the disposition, what's the purpose, where are the kids at that point in time. A windy Friday afternoon is not the time to teach the kids a lesson about sit down, shut up, do the work, da, 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 surprise, pop quiz, surprise test, all of that sort of stuff. We need to think really carefully about that. But we have to go further than that. What we have to talk about is innately what can we do to create environments that prompt certain dispositions.
Mm.
So if you're a teacher and you're trying to do some sort of inquiry work and you've just done 5 to 10 minutes of pretty solid and determined behaviour management of a group of students in the classroom, you're going to have to think really carefully about turning around to the rest of the kids and say, and now kids, what I'd really like you to do is wonder and reflect about all the lovely things. You know what I mean? It's like you need to understand the
Counterintuitive.
tone of a room. You need to understand the tone of the room. You really, you need to be able to create a space where things are possible. I learned this. I learned this as a young teacher. I learned that if I wanted to teach a topic to kids, whether that was for a week or a month or 2 months or 3 days, I had to begin with story time.
Mm.
Um, and I developed the capacity. I developed the capacity to tell the entire story of a topic all in one go. And to do that, I'd get the kids to move the desks aside and we'd all sit on the floor like it was story time at camp or story time at home, because I had young kids at that point in time. So it was like, come on, bedtime story.
Mm.
And get into that space of, so what comes next? And what comes next? And what comes next? And what comes next? I wasn't a skilled enough teacher or intentional enough at that point in time to understand that what I was doing was creating an environment which prompted the disposition towards curiosity. Because if I'm going to try and teach students about causation about agency and relative merit, which are the three main sort of SAE type things that we do in history, the three main analytical tasks, as well as some evaluative work as well too. We have to put the story together first. But if we don't prompt the curiosity about what comes next, what comes next, what comes next, then the hard grind of the direct instruction that has to follow about facts, dates, people, get it right, etc., can't work. So the disposition to curiosity prompts the disposition to acquire knowledge. And then that then gets replaced by the disposition to pull apart, to deconstruct, and then the disposition to retell the story at the end. So that's part of the skill of the teacher, is thinking about how do I get the students' sense of their why to match the how that we need to do together.
There's so much humanity in it. There's so much humanity in teaching. And I think whenever we feel ourselves pulled away from instinct, from intention, from that sense of shared humanity, it's such a great warning sign that, like, this probably isn't a best practice. If it's feeling like a prison, if it's feeling like a must, if it's feeling burdensome to us or our learners, it's just a beautiful, easy metric that we can give both to leaders and teachers that, wait, let's press pause here and come back to the intention behind this and what that practice might look like. I would be remiss, because you mentioned a few moments ago that you've run the longest research study ever about character development. So as a kind of final question for you today, I'm wondering about any other ahas that you've had from that research, or just things that really light you up when you learned about them.
It's going to sound really, really obvious.
The best
But
things
the
always
work,
do.
oh, they do. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of them already. The notion that we teach who we are, I think, is just really, really important. And it is obvious, but it takes a really, really long study to focus on that interaction between an older person and a younger person. So perhaps if I leave you with this, our world is changing fast. Education is changing fast. I've just written a paper on artificial intelligence and on the disposition that schools and school districts are going to need to make artificial intelligence work. Because if we're not careful, we're going to end up teaching kids for a world that absolutely no longer exists, because so much of daily life is being driven by large language models and predictive artificial intelligences and so on and so on. As we're sitting there and thinking about what it is that our schools need to do to adapt to be schools for tomorrow, we also need to remember that there is an enduring truth about schools, and that is that they are places that people have deemed to be necessary as a social good, where younger people come to learn from each other and from and with older people who act as their guides towards how they might live a life that is fruitful, that is that builds a sense of belonging, that allows people to fulfill their potential and to do good and right in the world. So at the end of the day, schools are that social place where young people come to be guided, to be led, and to be taught by older people about the people who they need to become to thrive in the world. And we can get lost in a school very, very easily, can't we, around the stuff that's happening every day, and there's always a drama, and there's always this going on and that going on, and factions forming, and push all that sort of stuff aside. My friend and colleague Adriano De Prado, who I know has been a guest on your program here previously, he would say that every student is home to a unique life, and so therefore schools need to be homes for learning, where we bring young people together, we allow them to rehearse for that life that's going to be worthwhile and well lived, and that we as the adults have such an important role to play in that. That's the big aha. I don't know if it sounds really big to you, but
I gotta say,
helps me keep going on a cold day.
the concept of like the continuity of school, or school as a continuous concept across time, is pretty mind-blowing to me, and I'd never really thought of that before. And what a grounding idea for all the work that we do as school leaders. So very much a worthwhile aha, my friend.
Oh, thank you. And to give you to leave you on a really practical note around that. Our First Peoples in Australia, our First Nations, our Indigenous folk, have been here for at least 65,000 years, possibly longer than that. You go to the very centre of Australia, and there's a big rock called Uluru, which has been there for millions, billions of years, and folk have been living in and around that rock for years. Probably 40, 50, 60,000 years at least. When you look at the caves at the side of the road, I know this because I went for a drive around Australia at Christmas time and spent some time at Uluru. When you go to the caves at the very base, you will find that they've been carved out, and there's one of them which is known as the kitchen, and that's a place where women and girls prepared food that was gathered and so on and so on and so on. And you can see that it's not just a kitchen; it's a school. It's a place where young people gathered with older people to learn the things that would help them lead a life and then one day be able to do the same thing for their children. This is normal. School is normal, natural, human behaviour. And so what we need to do is find ways that allow us to propel forward to tomorrow's world, but still tell that continuing story of yesterday and today that links to tomorrow.
Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on today. Really, just your perspective as a historian and the way that you tell the story. Just again, it makes it so much more accessible. We think in narrative, and I just really, really appreciate your insight and the work that you do.
Oh, Cindy, thank you so much, and thank you for the work you do and this wonderful podcast, and the way in which you're sharing stories that can help school leaders and chalkies everywhere find ways to take the big step forward and up.